Okay, let us return our attention to the history of the papacy during the middle period of the medieval era. The last time we were together, Leo IX died about 1054, just a month after his friend Humbert had laid that sentence of anathema on the altar of Hagia Sophia, thereby instigating the schism between the Western and Eastern churches. All right, about 20 years after Leo's death, his friend Hildebrand became the Pope. You'll remember that Hildebrand was the other friend, as well as Humbert, who accompanied Leo when he walked barefoot into the city of Rome, asking the people to acclaim him the Pope. Hildebrand took the name Gregory. He was the seventh of that name. And so Pope Gregory the Seventh is a significant figure in this period of time. He was a reformer, just as Leo had been. And even though Leo instigated the reform, historians have named the reform after Gregory the Seventh, obviously a significant figure in this movement. The goal of the Gregorian Reform was to emancipate clergy from secular control. Remember that for the past 100 years or so, the Holy Roman Emperor has been naming the popes. Okay, now this was necessary at the end of the pornocracy for a secular leader to take control of appointing decent men in this position. But Leo, Gregory, and others, they wanted to emancipate the clergy from this kind of control. Remember also that we are in the period of time when feudalism is the system of government. Remember that nobles are granting land to the church for cathedrals and monasteries, and so the nobles are wanting control over the clergy in their territories. All right, and so the union of church and state has become more and more entangled, and so the Gregorian reformers want to remove that entanglement. All right, so they centralize the power of the church by making clergy subject to the Pope. And then also they want to force the civil rulers to act in the Pope's best interests. How do they do that? Well, they have at least three tools of papal control. One is excommunication. Excommunication is just what it sounds like. It is a exclusion of a person from communion, excommunication. This excludes a person from participation in the life of the church and the grace that it provides. Remember that through the centuries, the church has made itself more and more central to the process of forgiveness and salvation through penance and through Mass and through prayers to eliminate or minimize purgatory. And so, and also the sacraments, whereby grace is communicated to the participants. And so, if you excommunicate a person, if you remove that person from having access to the Mass, to the elements of the Lord's Supper, they are going to be removed from access to grace itself. All right, and so excommunication is a powerful tool for an individual. The next tool is even broader. It's known as the interdict. And if the ruler of a territory acts against the Pope, then the Pope can prohibit all the clergy in his territory from exercising their offices and administering the sacraments. So imagine you live in a nation or even a city, and your ruler has gotten crosswise with the Pope. And so now all the clergy in the city are prohibited from administering the sacraments. Everyone in that region has lost access to grace. No one can get married. Babies cannot be baptized. The last rites cannot be administered. And so the people in that city, in fear for their very eternal lives, they're going to rise up and force their leader to submit to the Pope because of the threat of interdict. And the other tool is the civil ban. The Pope can declare his enemy an outlaw, and so all political obligations to him are declared null and void. This would include the obligations of homage that a vassal has toward a noble, a lord. Okay, and so a nobleman would lose all of the rights that are owed to him by his vassalage, by his benefits that he has invested in his vassal. All right, and so all of these tools are used by the Pope, and obviously the severity increases with the recalcitrance of the opponent. So this will be an important background to the lay investiture controversy. The lay investiture controversy raises the question of who had the right to confer the insignia of office upon bishops, abbots, and other clergy. What do we mean by this? We've talked about the feudal church. We've talked about the nobility who will give land to a bishop or an abbot or abbess. There is a investiture ceremony by which the noble grants this land. And part of this ceremony is an insignia that symbolizes the gift that the noble is bestowing. All right. In terms of the land is, if it's agricultural, the noble would give a sheaf of wheat. If livestock is the primary produce of the land, the noble would give a sheep or even a cow. All right, just as a symbol of the land that the noble is giving. But in terms of the position, he would give a bishop or any other clergyman a crozier, a staff symbolizing it's a shepherd's crook symbolizing the office. And so the noble wanted to give the crozier to the person receiving his donation in order to demonstrate that the clergyman is obligated to the nobleman. Well, you can imagine that the Pope said no, that the Pope was the one who would give the insignia of office. Remember, going back to Gregory the First, Gregory insisted that as Pope, he would give the pallium, the cloak, to the bishop to show that the Pope has spiritual authority over the clergyman. And so there is a great controversy between Gregory the Seventh and Henry the Fourth, who is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Henry IV had been an orphan. His parents had died when he was young, and so he was actually raised by the church, with the Pope being his regent, governing in his behalf. And so the Pope expected that when Henry came into his office that he would be more subservient to the church. But no, during the time of his growth and just before his accession to the empire, there were others who opposed him, and civil war was threatened. And so Henry wanted to be sure that all the bishops in his territory were loyal to him. And so he and Gregory had serious issues over who would grant the insignia of the bishops, who had the authority to appoint the bishops. Henry called a council of the bishops in his region. They gathered and deposed Gregory. In other words, they claimed that he was not the legitimate pope. Gregory, in turn, excommunicated Henry. And so Henry, in fear of losing his salvation, had to appeal to Pope Gregory. But Gregory withdrew to a castle in Canossa during the winter of 1077, and he made Henry wait outside, standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging for Gregory's pardon. All right, the abbot of the monastery at Cluny visited Gregory and insisted that Gregory must pardon his parishioner, who is humbly begging for forgiveness. And so Gregory was forced to pardon Henry, even though neither one trusted the other. Well, Henry left Canossa. He returned to his throne. He was forgiven, but nonetheless, he still was threatened by civil war. Gregory actually supported the usurper who was opposed to Henry, but then Henry overcame his usurper. He won the civil war, and so then he took his army and marched against Rome. Gregory was forced to flee into exile, where he died, and there his last words supposedly were, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." All right, and so we see this development of the investiture conflict. It reached its high point in the opposition between Gregory VII and Henry IV, but nonetheless, there were a number of investiture conflicts throughout the church during this period. Now, the Concordat of Worms took place in 1122 and resolved the conflict between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. The decision was that the clergy would be chosen by the church, but this investiture ceremony would take place in the presence of the feudal lords, or the emperor, as the case may be. The church would grant to the clergy the symbols of pastoral authority. So the church would grant the crozier. The secular lords, however, would grant the symbols of the rights and the property that they awarded to the clergy. So the Concord of Worms provided a template for settling investiture controversies throughout Christendom, and it provided a compromise where the church granted the symbols of clerical authority, but the nobles granted the symbols of the land that they were granting. Now, the last of the Gregorian reformers was Urban II, and he was the last pope of this reform. He also was a reformer influenced by the monastery at Cluny. We'll talk more about the Cluniac monastic reform in our next lecture. Urban II is best known for being the pope of the First Crusade. Therefore, we'll talk much more about Urban II when we get to that lecture. But Urban II also is known for having decreed the truce of God. We discussed that earlier as we admired the influence of the church on the state. This idea that during the Sabbath day, during the season of Advent, the season of Lent, that war could not take place under threat of excommunication. All right, so we have come to the end of this era of the papacy. We have much more to say about the papacy in a future lesson. But next, we're going to turn our attention to the same period of time, this 300-year period from 800 to 1100. But we're going to look at monasticism, and so that'll be the topic of our next lesson when I return one more time to talk to you. All right. So until then, peace be with you.